If this profound, isolating struggle with the unshakable weight of past mistakes resonates with the quiet, persistent guilt in your own heart, I ask you to do one small thing before we proceed further into my private chamber of regrets. Share this reflection on shame and redemption with one person you know who is currently searching for their purpose, haunted by a choice they cannot forgive. They cover me now with fine wool and cedar oil, and the court musicians play gentle melodies to soothe the great King David. They call me the Anointed, the Shepherd King, the one who established the throne forever, the man after God's own heart. Yet I must confess, this velvet does not warm me. It merely reminds me of the cold, unyielding stones of my own judgment. This late stage of life, which should by all rights be the season of peaceful reflection and spiritual rest, is, for me, the perpetual season of internal reckoning. And I, the great King of Israel, pass every solitary, sleepless morning revoking the public worship I receive by obsessively revivifying one single catastrophic night of a long-ago summer with a man whose murder I orchestrated with cold, calculated, political precision. I'm no longer fighting Goliath. I'm fighting the memory of Uriah's absolute loyalty, which stalks the gilded hallways of my mind far more relentlessly and fiercely than any enemy army ever did. This crisis is not of faith in the divine. That light remains steadfast. My true crisis is the utter paralyzing collapse of faith in David, the man stripped bare of all his titles and songs. The great ironic paradox of my existence, the truth that is slowly fracturing my sanity, is this: the world, and indeed the eternal, forgave me. The prophet Nathan came. He spoke the hard, undeniable truth to my face, and the divine mercy, swift and vast, washed over the public record of my sin, promising redemption. Yet here is the secret I carry, the one that makes this opulent palace feel less like a home and more like a claustrophobic tomb. The king cannot forgive the man. I hold myself to a standard of righteousness and purity, far more rigid and unforgiving than the Eternal ever dared to impose. I am crippled not by the inevitable consequence of my action, for I have suffered the loss of sons and the humiliation of betrayal, but by the profound, pervasive Vergogna chronica of realizing the depth of the darkness I was capable of embracing. This unrelenting guilt is the deep-seated depression of my old age, an unyielding condemnation that wraps itself around every joyous memory, relentlessly whispering that none of it, not the triumphant psalms, not the glorious victories, not the sacred kingdom itself, was genuinely deserved by a soul so capable of calculated evil and cold-blooded treachery. I look at the young men who surround me, my sons and grandsons, preparing to take the stage of their own lives, full of the robust, arrogant confidence of youth, and I physically recoil. I recoil because I know the capability for devastating darkness that lives, dormant or active, in the human heart, and I know precisely what unchecked success and power can do to the fragile nature of integrity. They see the legendary hero who defeated the giant and unified the tribes. I see the utterly contemptible coward who hid safely on his rooftop while his dedicated army fought and then callously signed the death warrant of an innocent, fiercely loyal friend, merely to cover a moment of fleeting, lustful weakness. This profound, agonizing dissonance between the public legend and the private, lived truth is the core of my current mental crisis. I have outwardly achieved everything that a mortal man could ever dream of, yet I am terrified of solitude, because solitude always brings the unforgiven past to vivid, unbearable, and immediate life. Do not allow yourself the illusion that the simple passage of time cleanses this specific spiritual stain. It does not. Time merely refines the guilt, making the details of the betrayal sharper and the burden of the memory heavier in the quiet evenings. You who are in your maturity, you who carry the weight of decades, you understand this truth deeply. The sins and moral compromises of our youth are the vengeful ghosts that inevitably come home to roost when we retire from the immediate, distracting chaos of doing and achieving. They arrive when the noise of a career and the consuming duty of raising a family fades, forcing us to confront the choices we made out of panic, ambition, profound selfishness, or blind, destructive pride. The great national poet, the author of sacred texts, now find myself utterly speechless when facing my own reflection, because the words of my most beautiful psalms often feel like a calculated lie I meticulously wrote for the public, rather than an achieved, honest truth I truly lived for myself. This deep, chronic inability to internally accept my own redemption is the heaviest chain that binds the anointed King of Israel to his stool in the palace. I wear the coveted title Man After God's Own Heart, not as a comfortable honor, but as a rigid, itchy garment of rough sackcloth. It is not a source of comfort. It is a profound, relentless demand for self-scrutiny and an impossible internal perfection. It loudly tells the world he is righteous, he is redeemed. But in the silence of my conscience, it screams to me, you betrayed the one who loved you most, you destroyed an innocent, and you deserve none of this glory you currently possess. My current physical decline, the intense chills, the generalized weakness, the failing sight, feels less like the natural, gentle course of life, and more like a just, slow-moving spiritual punishment for the atrocities I committed in my strength. I yearn for the simplicity of the shepherd's field, where my biggest mistakes were only against a few lost sheep, not against the eternal covenant or against the sacred life of a loyal man. The deep emotional truth I must confess is that I am not sure my core purpose, my spiritual integrity, ever fully recovered from that fall. My kingship continued, my national duties continued, my magnificent psalms continued to flow, but the fundamental wellspring of my true joy and peace was poisoned the day I murdered Uriah. I have struggled intensely for years to distinguish the genuine purpose, serving the eternal with a pure heart, from the desperate penance, working tirelessly to outrun the gnawing shame. I fear profoundly that all my later accomplishments, building the temple plans, consolidating the political kingdom, were merely penance, highly visible acts designed solely to quiet the unrelenting internal voice of self-condemnation, rather than acts flowing from a truly free, forgiven, and spiritually healthy heart. The paralyzing question that haunts my final years is whether it is authentically possible to recover true, unburdened purpose when the very foundation of your adult identity is built, metaphorically and literally, on a grave you deliberately dug yourself. This crisis of self-condemnation is universal. It transcends kingdoms, centuries, and religions. It is the fear that you are inherently and fundamentally unworthy of the grace, success, or happiness you have been given. But I promise you, the key to unlocking the true peace of your later years is not further exhausting penance. It is a radical, painful confrontation with the unearned nature of mercy. Do not let the ghost of your past choices continue to define the ultimate purpose of your present existence. Stay with me, because the moment I finally broke my cycle of self-condemnation, the exact moment that frees you too from your own self-imposed prison, is revealed in the profound silence that follows the ultimate, inevitable betrayal. The deepest anguish of my old age stems from the realization that the silence of the palace is more terrifying than the clamor of the battlefield. When the great mission, the fighting, the unifying, the constant management of a fledgling kingdom begins to slow, the void that rushes in is immense and utterly unforgiving. I was defined for so long by action, by the physical courage of the warrior, and by the sheer momentum of my ambition. Now, retired from the heat of battle and relegated to the supervision of my successor, I possess the one luxury I never wanted: time. Time to reflect, time to remember, time to let the guilt, which had been successfully buried beneath decades of administrative chaos, surface and consume every waking hour. This enforced stillness is the true crucible of maturity, where the distractions fade and you are left, starkly and painfully, with the full unvarnished inventory of your soul's failures. My life, once vibrant and overflowing with the raw energy of youth and the divine fire of purpose, has settled into a profound, suffocating monotonia of regret. This is the nature of the depression that strikes the powerful in their later years. It is not the sadness of having lost everything, but the crushing weight of having gained everything through profoundly questionable means. I look out at the magnificent city of Jerusalem, the culmination of my life's work, and feel utterly disconnected from its glory, viewing it primarily as the stage where I performed my most profound hypocrisy. I should find solace in the Psalms I wrote, but now they often taste of ash, sounding less like genuine worship and more like desperate, high-pitched pleas for self-justification. The true crisis is that the external temple of my kingdom is glorious, but the internal temple, the sanctuary of my soul, has utterly crumbled, leaving only the echo of my moral treason. The crushing weight of my luto paralisante is centered on my children, the price I paid for my betrayal. I lost the son born to Bathsheba, a swift and brutal consequence of my sin, and later the tragic, self-inflicted pain of Absalom's rebellion and death. The shame is no longer just about Uriah, the loyal soldier. It is about the wounding of the future, the generational consequence of my moral failures. I, the great father of the nation, failed catastrophically as a father in my own household, breeding chaos and death where there should have been order and grace. This realization is what drives the depression, the understanding that my personal sins became public, bloody disasters for those I loved most. How can I, who brought such ruin to my own seed, possess the audacity to claim to be the righteous foundation for an eternal kingdom? I confess that I find myself trying desperately to recapture the simplicity of the shepherd boy, the clarity of that identity before the crown, before the corruption of absolute power. That boy knew right from wrong. He only fought giants in the open field, not in the shadows of his palace. But the man I am now is hopelessly entangled in the political web of my own making, a king whose heart is a museum of his own compromises. The profound struggle in this second act is the inability to distinguish between the love I truly earned and the obedience I merely commanded. This constant toxic self-questioning has poisoned my rest, leading to the physical ailment of chills and weakness, which feels less like aging and more like the appropriate spiritual consequence for a cold heart. The paralyzing question that strikes me in the stillness of the night is this: if God has truly forgiven me, why am I still utterly incapable of forgiving myself? The voice of the divine is one of unconditional mercy, a deep, cleansing roar of pardon. But the voice of David is a relentless accuser, a judge who insists on carrying the punishment even after the sentence has been lifted. This toxic self-condemnation is the final, most tenacious enemy of the soul, the one we erect ourselves after all external foes have been vanquished. I have conquered the Philistines, but I remain a terrified, guilt-ridden captive in the prison built by my own unforgiving memory. This existential emptiness is the inevitable result of defining one's worth by performance and achievement rather than by grace. I sought to outrun the shame by composing more psalms, by fighting more battles, by expanding the kingdom, always trying to earn back the virtue I had lost. But the harder I worked, the louder the emptiness became, confirming that my deepest need was not for a greater victory, but for a simple, quiet self-acceptance. The paradox is that the very success I achieved became the constant reminder of the failure I committed, turning my triumphs into instruments of self-punishment. My friends, If you recognize this crushing fatigue, the weight of guilt that the world has already forgotten, but which your own soul refuses to release, then you must stay with me. This journey through the darkest valleys of my own making is leading to a profound, radical truth about self-redemption. Do not let the ghost of your past choices claim the future peace you deserve. Do not turn away now. The moment of ultimate exposure, the confrontation that finally forces the liberation from chronic shame, is the revelation that awaits us. The greatest performance of my life was not slaying Goliath or dancing before the ark. It was the meticulous, lifelong maintenance of the mask of the pious king. After my monumental fall, the betrayal of Uriah and Bathsheba, I was forced to become the most devout, the most humble, the most publicly repentant sovereign in the history of our people. This facade was necessary for the stability of the kingdom and the continuity of the covenant, yet it became the very chain that bound my soul. I was living a life of profound hypocrisy, a king who wrote the liturgy of worship while his heart felt entirely profane. I led the sacrifices, I poured out the oil, I spoke the sacred words, all while the cold, dark knowledge of my calculated malice whispered that every act of piety was merely an elaborate, futile attempt to convince myself, more than my subjects, that I deserved the grace I preached. The price for being the man after God's own heart was the total, agonizing suppression of the broken, guilty man I knew myself to be. The profound tragedy of this sustained deception is that I weaponized my own faith against my own soul. I did not write the great psalms of repentance, like the 51st, merely to express remorse. I wrote them as a desperate act of autopunition and public atonement. I used my talent, my poetic genius, to craft chains of guilt, constantly forcing my heart to revisit the atrocity in vivid detail, believing that the constant self-flagellation was the only way to hold on to the precarious mercy I had been granted. The more beautifully I lamented, the more convinced I became that I was paying the unpayable debt. This is the subtle poison of religious performance in maturity. We try to earn the pardon that was freely given, turning the gift of grace into a grinding, impossible penance. This exhaustion, the effort of performing piety while wrestling with internal filth, is what ultimately broke my spirit far more effectively than any external enemy ever could. You who have achieved status in your later years, you understand the suffocating pressure of sustaining the lie. You know the weight of being the CEO who made morally bankrupt decisions on the rise, the pillar of the community who harbors deep, unforgiven resentments, or the devoted parent who betrayed their own partner. I tell you, that public image, that perfect persona, is the cross we crucify our true selves upon. The guilt I felt for Uriah was compounded by the shame of having to pretend I was worthy to lead his people. Every time I had to sit in judgment, upholding the very law I had so cynically violated, I felt the tremors of my own collapsing integrity. I became a master of masks, a king whose public strength was directly proportional to his private, crushing weakness. The ultimate price I paid for maintaining this facade was the chaos I unleashed within my own family. The rot of my secret sin became the open infection of my household. My sons, observing the profound dissonance between the king's public piety and the father's private moral compromise, mirrored the chaos. Absalom's rebellion, the ultimate betrayal that forced me to flee my own palace, was not just a political crisis. It was the horrific, unavoidable consequence of my failure to lead myself with honesty and integrity. The guilt, which I tried to bury beneath a mountain of good works, sprouted into the very family tragedy that nearly destroyed my kingdom and my life. My personal sin became a generational curse, and that burden of legacy is the true weight that crushes the soul in old age. I realize now that my deep resentment was rooted in my refusal to accept the unconditional nature of mercy. I believed that such a vast pardon must demand an equally vast penance, and I appointed myself the executor of that endless punishment. This self-condemnation was my final, most sophisticated attempt at control. If I could punish myself severely enough, perhaps I could finally feel cleansed, finally feel worthy. But self-condemnation is the antithesis of freedom. It kept me emotionally paralyzed, trapped in the past, unable to receive the full restorative power of the grace that was already mine. I was a king, living as a spiritual prisoner, bound not by the sins I committed, but by the relentless internal judge I appointed over my own soul. This paralysis of guilt is the crisis that defines your maturity. You look at your successful life, and the voice of self-condemnation screams that you don't deserve the peace you currently enjoy because of the failures you conceal. But I promise you, the freedom of your later years lies not in denying those failures, but in exposing the facade of perfection. The moment you stop performing and accept the unvarnished truth of your broken humanity, you unlock a profound power. My ultimate strength came not when I ran from my enemies, but when I ran toward the truth of my shame, finally admitting that the king was also the assassin. This transition from self-punishment to self-acceptance is the key to a purposeful second act. If you are ready to finally silence the relentless internal judge and transform your shame into a song of resilience, I urge you to join this intimate community. Follow this channel and start sharing your own journey towards self-forgiveness in our dedicated space, transforming your hidden pain into shared power. My dark night of the soul was not fought against foreign armies. It was fought in the terrifying, exposed solitude of fleeing my own son. When Absalom's betrayal forced me to abandon Jerusalem, running barefoot and weeping up the Mount of Olives, stripped of my crown and dignity, the structure of my entire world finally shattered. That moment of absolute political and personal defeat was the ultimate necessary emptiness. I stopped performing the king and became, quite simply, the father who failed, the husband who betrayed, the man whose moral decay had bred chaos in his own home. There was nowhere left to hide, no city to conquer, no psalm to write that could immediately fix the catastrophic ruin of my life. That flight was the painful physical realization that my decades of penance and performance had failed to protect me from the natural, tragic consequences of my earlier moral collapse. The most profound realization in that moment of flight was that the voice of my shame was louder and more devastating than the voice of my sorrow. I didn't primarily mourn the loss of the kingdom. I mourned the utter, public exposure of my unworthiness. My life's work, my covenant with the Eternal seemed utterly destroyed, and I was left alone to face the raw truth that my sin against Uriah was not merely a political maneuver, but an act of profound spiritual treason against the source of my own moral guidance. In the silence of that desperate journey, I stopped trying to argue with God about why I deserved punishment and started confronting the internal judge who kept insisting on eternal condemnation. I finally ceased trying to earn redemption and faced the terrifying possibility that I might truly be irredeemable, which was, paradoxically, the moment my self-erected prison began to crack. This confrontation culminated in the writing of the 51st Psalm, a document born not of poetic inspiration, but of absolute spiritual collapse. It wasn't written when I was safe in the palace. It was written when the consequence of my actions, my own son, was hunting me down. This psalm is my most honest confession because it finally stops rationalizing and starts pleading for creation, not just forgiveness. I didn't beg for the return of the kingdom. I begged, "Create in me a clean heart, O God." I finally accepted that my own resources were utterly bankrupt. I could not clean the slate, I could not undo the murder, and I could not revive the innocent. The only way out of the suffocating, paralyzing cycle of guilt was the total surrender of my self-sufficiency and the desperate plea for a new, created identity. This radical admission that I needed to be made new rather than merely forgiven was the true point of no return. I surrendered the belief that I could somehow outwork my sin or that my suffering was sufficient penance. I finally understood that the mercy that the Eternal offered was truly unconditional, but the acceptance of that mercy was the hardest, most humiliating act of my life. Accepting the pardon meant accepting my brokenness without demanding a costly, self-inflicted toll. It meant relinquishing the control of my own punishment. The weight lifted not when I became perfect, but when I finally accepted the simple, terrifying truth that I was deeply loved and redeemed, despite being the worst kind of failure. This act of absolute internal surrender is the vital lesson for your own crisis of identity and maturity. When your own Absalom, your personal crisis, your failure, your past secret, forces you into the wilderness, do not attempt to maintain the facade or cling to the titles. You must embrace that moment of collapse as the necessary emptiness. The purpose of the vacuum is to strip away the performance and reveal the soul's profound need for something that cannot be earned. Stop trying to repair the old self that failed. Instead, use that moment of total brokenness to ask for a fundamentally new heart. Your true strength emerges when you finally stop trying to save yourself. I realized that the enduring value of my life was not the perfection of my rule, but the authenticity of my confession. My most powerful contribution to the world was not my heroism in the valley of Elah, but my vulnerability in the valley of self-condemnation. I learned that the depth of my failure was, ironically, the prerequisite for the depth of my empathy. The king who falls the farthest is the one best equipped to write the song of redemption for everyone else. My shame became the raw material for the most universally human expressions of spiritual need, transforming a personal atrocity into a timeless map for reconciliation. If you are standing today in your own point of silence, if the noise of your life has faded and you are left facing the unsparing truth of your past choices, paralyzed by the shame, know that you are exactly where you need to be. The resolution is not found in denial, but in the radical honesty of your surrender. I urge you to take this moment to break the silence, go to your journal, or even a blank page, and write down the single biggest regret that has defined your self-condemnation. Commit to confronting it with mercy, not judgment. Your freedom begins the moment you accept the possibility of a clean heart. The truth that finally emerged from the ashes of my self-condemnation was utterly simple, and for that reason, utterly revolutionary. My purpose in this latter stage of life was never meant to be about achieving new victories or erasing old sins. It was about demonstrating the radical, unearned power of redemption. I realized that the Eternal didn't want the perfect David, the hero who had never fallen, because that David would inspire mere admiration. He wanted the broken David, the man stained by murder and treachery, who had been lifted and loved despite his complete failure. My profound self-hatred had been a desperate attempt to control the narrative, to ensure my punishment matched my crime. But the great non-heroic discovery of my old age was that my greatest contribution was not my sword or my crown, but my willingness to stand imperfectly as the living, breathing testimony that mercy is real, even for the worst of us. My purpose was redefined from invincible king to flawed, yet forgiven witness. This realization shifted the focus from my performance, my endless striving to be good enough, to the unwavering, persistent nature of grace. The great wisdom of maturity is understanding that the most powerful thing you can do for the world is to be authentically healed. Stop trying to outrun your shadow. Instead, let your shadow, the ugly truth of your past, become the backdrop against which the light of your present transformation shines most brilliantly. My final decades were not defined by penance. They were defined by the profound peace that came from accepting that my value was inherent, tied to the covenant, and utterly detached from the moral grade I gave myself. This insight that my value persists despite my deepest shame is the most liberating gift of the mature soul. I finally understood the catastrophic failure of my self-appointed role as judge. My continued suffering, my chronic guilt, was not necessary for my redemption. It was an act of spiritual arrogance, a refusal to accept a pardon that I felt I hadn't adequately paid for. The true act of repentance was not in writing the psalm, but in finally living the psalm, in accepting the clean heart I begged for and ceasing to pollute it with constant, toxic self-judgment. My greatest contribution to the kingdom, therefore, was not my ability to rule perfectly, but my ability to embody the profound truth that redemption is not a reward for suffering. It is a gift that enables you to stop suffering. This acceptance freed up the emotional energy I had spent on self-punishment and allowed me to redirect it toward genuine outward purpose. This discovery is the essential map out of the crisis for you, the successful yet guilt-ridden soul in your maturity. Stop allowing the ghost of your past choices, the betrayal, the failed investment, the hurtful words spoken in anger, to define your present identity. Your most powerful contribution now is your transparency and your wisdom distilled from failure. You are not meant to achieve new levels of perfection. You are meant to show others that it is possible to rise from the dust of massive regret and still possess profound purpose. Your maturity is your greatest asset, precisely because you possess the scars and the stories that grant you the authenticity necessary to mentor the next generation with genuine empathy. I realize now that the tragic, devastating failures, Uriah, Bathsheba, Absalom, were not just roadblocks to my purpose. They were, in a twisted, painful way, prerequisites for the depth of my legacy. Had I been the flawless hero of youth, my songs would inspire mere admiration. Because I was the fallen, wretched king, my psalms inspire millions of broken hearts to believe they too can be restored. My value lies not in my perfection, but in my vulnerability, in my willingness to show the world the depth of the pit from which I was pulled. This is the purpose of the seasoned life. To transform the shame we sought to hide into the very light we now must shine, to guide others out of their own darkness. The purpose of my longevity, my sustained life into old age, was to give me the time necessary to fully internalize this self-acceptance and to pass on this radical truth to my successor, Solomon. I had to teach him that the kingdom is built not on human strength, but on the unwavering mercy that allows a man to stand again, even after a catastrophic fall. My final act of kingship was the gentle yet powerful act of mentorship, ensuring the next generation understood that the true power of the throne was its capacity for forgiveness, not its capacity for war. Your legacy is found in the simple, profound act of imparting your hard-won wisdom, not in clinging to the title that defines your past. This powerful insight that our deepest failure is the soil for our greatest purpose is the key to unlocking the peace you desperately crave. I urge you to transform this conversation into a definitive action in your life. Stop postponing your own peace. Go to your preferred social platform and share one sentence about how your greatest failure has paradoxically prepared you for your purpose today. Let us turn the tide of self-condemnation into a powerful wave of shared redemption. If the weight of your past failures, the betrayals, the financial missteps, the moments you deeply wounded someone you loved, is the heaviest burden you carry into your later years, then this is the practical map I offer you, drawn from the indelible ink of my own shame. The most crucial step toward renewed purpose is to immediately and definitively halt your self-punishment. I realized that the Eternal had lifted the sentence of death, yet I insisted on carrying the emotional executioner's sword. The guilt you harbor, the relentless self-condemnation that whispers, "You don't deserve this peace," is not piety. It is the ultimate act of spiritual arrogance, a refusal to accept the gift of grace that was freely extended. Stop trying to earn back your virtue through endless penance. Your maturity demands the courage to say, I accept the pardon, and I will stop doing the work of my own accuser. This is the only way to transform the destructive force of chronic guilt into the peaceful power of self-acceptance. Secondly, you must embrace the radical, difficult truth that your failure is your most powerful tool for legacy. Your experiences with treachery, manipulation, and the bitter taste of consequence are not blemishes to be hidden. They are the unique credentials that qualify you as a mentor and guide. The king who has never fallen can only offer theory. The king who has fallen catastrophically and survived can offer empathy and a practical map out of the darkness. Your purpose in this mature phase is to transform your shame into your most profound psalm, your deepest, most vulnerable truth that validates the suffering of others. Stop running from the memory of your mistake. Instead, turn toward it, acknowledge its cost, and use that painful wisdom as the foundation upon which others can build their own redemption story. The map for your personal recommezo requires the courage to request a new heart, rather than merely trying to repair the old, broken one. My prayer in the 73rd Psalm, "Whom have I in heaven but you?" was a realization that my identity needed a new core. You must stop defining yourself by the roles that have ended, the CEO title, the parent of young children status, the flawless reputation, and ask for a fundamental shift in your being. This is the ultimate act of surrender in maturity, admitting that your own self-management has failed and choosing to believe in a fundamental spiritual renewal that transcends your own self-judgment. The wisdom of my old age is that true purpose begins the moment you stop trying to fix the past and start courageously asking for a clean, entirely new beginning for the future. Furthermore, you must consciously choose to focus your energy on what you build next, not what you broke before. I had to shift my focus from the grave of Uriah to the education of Solomon. My purpose was to distill the wisdom of my failure so that my successor could build the temple, the very project I was barred from completing. Your purpose in maturity is to find your Solomon, that project, that mentee, that community, and invest your hard-won knowledge into their future. This transition from possessor of the power to imparter of the wisdom is the non-heroic, sustainable path to renewed purpose. It is the peace found in realizing that your greatest value is not in being the architect of the success, but the guide who prevents the next generation from repeating your most devastating, soul-crushing errors. If you are haunted by the persistent voice of self-doubt, use my life as your proof. The king who fell the farthest is the one whose songs of mercy travel the furthest. Your failure is not a sign of eternal disqualification. It is the unique qualification you possess to offer profound empathy. Embrace the reality that your later years are not a time for further striving, but a time for radical honesty and gentle self-acceptance. The true strength of maturity lies in the humility to admit fault and the courage to receive grace without constantly demanding payment. Let your life's narrative become a testament to the fact that healing is possible, even when the scars are permanent and the consequences are lasting. The practical step is to begin the daily work of rewriting your internal narrative. Stop reciting the script of shame that your memory dictates. Replace the voice that says, "I am the assassin who betrayed his friend," with the truth, "I am the human, flawed king who was radically forgiven and whose life is now dedicated to demonstrating the power of that forgiveness." Your peace depends entirely on this intentional change in self-definition. The wisdom of the psalmist is that you have the power to choose your internal song. Choose the melody of mercy, not the dirge of condemnation. This map for transformation, the journey from condemnation to purpose, is a life-altering truth. We must use our collective vulnerability to affirm this new purpose. I urge you to take this internal map and begin sharing it with those who need it most. Use the direct link to this monologues and send it in a private message to one person who needs to hear the words, "You are forgiven." Let us use our own voice to break the silence of shame in the world. The final act of a long, turbulent life is not marked by a return to battle or a sudden burst of perfect health. It is marked by the quiet, profound act of letting go. As I sit here, fragile and aged, seeing the sun set over the city I built, the peace I carry is not the absence of regret, but the profound acceptance that my redemption did not erase the scars. It transformed them into a visible, enduring testament. I watch Solomon, the son born of the very wreckage I created, take the throne, and in his ascent I find my ultimate resolution. My peace is rooted in the realization that the Eternal used my deepest, most agonizing failure to pave the way for a generation of wisdom and grace. The legacy of the king is not the perfection of his reign, but the courage he demonstrated in finding purpose after his fall. My final contribution was simply the handing over of the mantle, accepting that my work was complete, even though it ended not in flawless glory, but in redeemed imperfection. This final transition, from the King of War to the Father of Peace, is the highest form of self-acceptance I ever achieved. I finally stopped demanding that my life be defined by the shining heroism of my youth and embraced the messy, complicated truth of my entire journey. My maturity brought the wisdom that the true value of my existence was not measured by my achievements, but by the relentless, humiliating process of being restored again and again. For those of you in your later years, searching for peace, this is your final, essential task. You must cease the spiritual war against yourself. The guilt you harbor, the shame that paralyzes you, is a shadow without substance, held in place only by your refusal to fully inhabit the forgiveness that has already been granted. Your strength is no longer in fighting. It is in resting in the absolute knowledge of your inherent, unearned worth. The profound truth I leave with you is this: the true promised land for the soul is not a place you march toward, but the internal state of radical self-acceptance you finally inhabit. You are no longer defined by the person who made that catastrophic mistake 20 years ago. You are defined by the weary, resilient, and wiser person who survived the consequences and chose to stand again. Your purpose in this final chapter is to use the pain of your past not as a weapon for self-condemnation, but as a compass to guide those who are now lost in their own valleys of shame. Transform your history of failure into a ministry of mercy, allowing your scars to become the map that shows others the way back to their own potential for peace and redemption. I had to learn, agonizingly, that the king who writes the Psalm of Repentance must also be the man who sings it without self-recrimination. Your new dawn demands that you fully embody the forgiveness you pray for. Stop postponing your happiness, believing you must first pay off a spiritual debt that was already cancelled. The cost of clinging to your guilt is the loss of your present peace and the destruction of your future purpose. Your life's greatest achievement, your ultimate victory, will be the day you finally look at your entire flawed history, the shepherd, the hero, the sinner, the father, and say, all of this, was necessary. This is the man I was meant to be, imperfections and all. And this sense of finality, the quiet, inevitable conclusion of my days, brings not fear, but profound gratitude for the second chance I received. My final contribution to the world was not a monument of stone, but the enduring melody of a redeemed heart. I implore you to accept that your story too has been repurposed by grace. Your life is a testament to resilience, a powerful narrative that can break the chains of shame for others. Do not let your dignity fade in silent guilt. Let your experience become a lighthouse. To complete this necessary journey from self-condemnation to purposeful peace, you must commit to an outward act of vulnerability. I ask you to use the wisdom you found here to lift someone else. Find one person in your life who is carrying a heavy, secret burden of guilt, and send them a brief, private message today that simply says, "Your story is not over. You are forgiven." Let us transform our private redemption into a shared public act of grace. And so the King rests. The battles are over, the penance is finished, and the shame is finally silent. I leave behind a legacy not of perfection, but of enduring radical mercy. Closing phrase, profound and final. I once believed God's forgiveness was for others, not for the killer I was. But your purpose is not found in destroying the past. It is found in transforming your shame into your most profound, life-giving psalm.